Welcome back to One Move at a Time, and this is part two. I'm back again with IM John Donaldson, and we're going to be discussing his extensive historical experience and perspective when it comes to Bobby Fischer in this interview. Welcome back, and I'd like to start the questioning process with you've written repeatedly about Fischer across decades, from a legend on the road to Bobby Fischer and his world, and most recently, Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer. What drives you to return to Fischer's life and work so often?
Well, part of it is the fact that, if it hadn't been for him, I might not be a chess player. It was the interest in the 1972 match that caused me to see that advertisement in the Tacoma News Tribune with the tournament. And it seems like, uh, it was meant to be, but maybe it wouldn't have if it hadn't been for Bobby. I think also another thing that sort of always fascinated me about Fischer is he's one of only two American world champions. Uh, Morphy, of course, predated the title of world champion, although he was the strongest player in the world uh, for a short period of time when he was an active player. The other world champion would be William Steinitz. He was Wilhelm before when he was living in Europe, but when he came to the United States, he changed his name to William, and he he was not a citizen of the United States in 1886 when he played the match with Zuckertort for the title, a match played in New York, St. Louis, and New Orleans, but he wanted already at that point to play with the American flag. He'd been living in the country for a couple of years. He did become naturalized in the late 1880s, and so many of the matches that he played for the World Championship title, subsequent to the one with Zuckertort, he was an American citizen and played under the American flag. Uh, he wrote The Modern Chess Instructor, while living in the United States. He edited the International Chess Magazine while living in the United States. So Steinitz definitely was an American, and so he and Fischer were the world champions. So I think the fact that Fischer is in this unique position for American chess, he's one of the arguably three strongest players in the history of the game with Kasparov and Carlsen. The other two kind of depends on how you define the strongest player. Should it be for longevity? Maybe Lasker even gets thrown in there, or should it be for a shining at the brightest for the and totally eclipsing all of his contemporaries by the largest margin? Then Fischer's got his claim to fame. Uh, but also, he just has a really fascinating uh, story to tell about his life. I think the fact that I was born in 1958, so Fischer came up right before I was born. So that when for me, it's like having an interest in history. I've always sort of found the period of like the 1950s, uh, to be one that's like less on people's radar. I mean, the 60s immediately registers strong reactions, positive or negative in a lot of people, but the 50s are sort of like, kind of like the sleepy decade, but maybe actually not so sleepy in fact. And for chess, it was a very interesting time for the United States as well. There weren't that many people in the U.S. Chess Federation. I would say like in 1960 it was under 5,000, but those that played the game were especially keen and passionate about it, and there were all sorts of magazines being published, and we had great players like Fischer and Reshevsky and Lombardi and Evans, so Robert Burns. So it was, so Bobby's sort of always been on my radar, but I've also been the kind of the beneficiary that, Frank Brady wrote a really excellent series of books on Bobby. I would call them a trilogy. Two of them have the same title, Profile or Prodigy, but they're much different books. And then Endgame. So if those books hadn't been out there, I might not have been as interested in Fischer as I am now, because they kind of got me really fascinated with him. And in fact, I would say these last two books are partly like they're a follow up to those books. When I was reading those books, there was I had certain questions that were not answered, and because I mean that's only 1,000 pages. I would have wanted a book of like 3,000 pages to answer all my questions. So as a result, I sort of started digging and doing research. And I would say that out of all the research I've done, the most fascinating has occurred at the World Chess Hall of Fame in St. Louis. And, everybody knows about the St. Louis Chess Club and all the fantastic tournaments that they have. Rex and Jeannie Sinkfield have, they are the greatest benefactors of American chess that we've ever had. And we've had some great ones. We had Jacqueline Piatigorsky, there was Jose Cucci in the 1980s, there was Louis Statham with Lone Pine, there was Professor Rice, even going back into the ancient times. There were Rosenwald. There were like all these different patrons, but the Sinkfields like dwarf their contributions. I should also mention a more recent one is the Sanford family that sponsored the Sanford Fellowship for close to 40 years. I mean, just incredibly generous. But besides the St. Louis Chess Club, right across the street is the World Chess Hall of Fame. And so here you have a chance to, if you're a chess fan of any sort, you have like these two like must-sees, and they're right across the street from each other. And the World Chess Hall of Fame is like on 3 floors, and they always have new fresh exhibitions. It's not like it's a static museum that's always showing the same stuff all the time. And typically on the 3rd floor, where they have their permanent exhibits on the U.S. and World Chess Hall of Fame, they have like a hardcore chess content exhibition, and they've had several on Fischer. And I've been fortunate to be involved with them, and one of the, literally one of the most golden moments in my life was sitting down and going through their most recent acquisition, which came to the Marshall Chess Club. Bobby, in the late 1950s, started living on his own. The year, actually it was 1960, it was in the fall. And by that point his sister Joan had married, and his mother, Regina, she had decided in the fall of 1960 to go on a walk to protest in support of nuclear disarmament. And this walk wasn't just she didn't just talk, she walked the walk, literally. She walked from San Francisco to New York City, hopped on a plane to London, walked down to Dover, hopped on a ferry to France, and then walked to Moscow. Well, when she was planning to leave New York, she realized, I'm not sure when I'm getting back here. This is a rent-controlled apartment. This is a good thing to have for young Bobby. But I don't know if I want to leave like all the family heirlooms with him. He's like 17 years old. Who knows what'll happen. So I'll entrust this material to my older child, my daughter, Joan, and she was married to Russell Targ. And she and Russell moved from New York City with all the Fischer family heirlooms, and they settled in Northern California. And for the better part of like the next 50 years, these artifacts stayed in an attic. And then at some point, after Joan died and Russell decided to move, these articles were unearthed. And alongside all the Fischer records, from the family history and things of that sort, there was all these score sheets of Bobby's. And there were score sheets from 1955 to 1960. And not only were there score sheets, but there were photographs, and there were letters. And it was just like it was like opening up a time capsule and just discovering all this gold. And I was able to go through this, and it was just a really humbling experience because, for example, there was correspondence between Regina and Folke Rogard, who was the president of FIDE, and you discovered that, like, after Bobby played in 1959 in Zurich in May, uh, the question was what to do. And well, in respect to the fact that he would be playing in the interzonal that fall in Yugoslavia. Well, you'd think the natural thing to do would be to go home back to New York and then sometime in early September fly back. But at that point in time, airfares were really expensive. If you're a youngster today and the concept of inflation is not on your radar, reading about what airfares cost then and what they cost now, it will definitely be eye opener. And so, commercial flights, I don't know the exact history of it, but probably they started to become more prevalent, like, in the early to mid 1950s. And by the late 1950s, many more people were probably flying to Europe than were taking a boat. And definitely it was trending that way in an accelerating fashion. So it was expensive. I mean, even if you look at the fares today to go to Europe, they might have to pay $600 in 1960. But if you consider the purchasing power of the dollar, I don't know precisely, but it might be like a tenth of that. It might be the equivalent of like $6,000. That might be a little high, but it was a very expensive thing to do, to fly between the United States and Europe. Not something that you were going to do routinely. And so Regina wanted Bobby to stay in Europe. She didn't want him to have to fly back to the United States because, the U.S. Chess Federation had no money to fly Bobby to Yugoslavia in the first place. And not only that, but this is an interzonal. He should have a coach. There was like no money in the kitty for that. Now, it turned out ultimately that by August of 59, I should say, that money did in fact appear. And the American Chess Foundation was willing to kick in some money, and various individuals contributed to a fund so that Bobby not only was able to play in the candidates tournament, but he was able to have Bent Larson as a second. But all this was very, very unclear if you read the correspondence between Rogard and Regina, which goes from like May until August. So there it is that Bobby, who is 16 years old, he's traveling around Europe on his own. I don't think you could do that today. I think that I think Regina would get hauled into court for not fulfilling her parental duties, and I think also various customs officials around Europe would probably an unaccompanied minor would find it hard to travel for reasons that things were just different in 1959, and so Bobby traveled from Zurich, and then he ended up like down in Dubrovnik, and he was hanging out there. He took a ferry to Venice, and he was just I don't think he was visiting all the art museums and absorbing all European culture. I think he was just kind of hanging out and just studying chess all the time, which fair enough. That sort of first-hand experience behind the scenes I found fascinating. Also, the question was like, how were they going to get who's going to be Bobby's second? And at one point it looked like it might be O'Kelly. At another point it looked like it might be Bent Larson. And then at a certain point, Bobby's like calling his mother sporadically, like every couple of weeks, because it's very expensive to make international phone calls. And there's she's sending him like postcards, post restant to various European towns. But it's not so easy for her to keep track of the 16-year-old's wanderings around. And at a certain point, like Larson and Fischer is trying to meet up. Nowadays, people would just get on their cell phone, and like in 5 seconds they would make the hookup. But in those days, they didn't have that, so they were constantly like, one guy would be in one town and waiting for the other one, but the other one had just left, and it was kind of interesting to read all about this. Also, there was all this correspondence between Bobby and Yugoslav chess fans. He had played in the interzonal in 1958, and he had not only qualified to play in the candidates, but he'd also made a lot of Yugoslav friends. But these weren't grandmasters. These weren't international masters. They were just like amateur chess players that befriended him. And it was interesting to see him, the correspondence. I'm only seeing Fischer's side, the letters to Fischer, but you can kind of read between the lines, of what Bobby must have written to them. And, just fascinating stuff.
Ah, that's amazing. It sounds absolutely like just a treasure trove, and as you put it, a time capsule of giving more perspective. Because I have to assume when seeing the competition of the tournaments that travel was taken care of. He's got an adult traveling with him. It adds a completely different perspective that Fischer, for the most part, as a teenager, is just jet setting and making his own way.
Right.
It's amazing.
I mean, you see somebody like Hans Niemann, he was, doing something somewhat analogous to that, a little bit older, mind you. But the thing you have to realize, Brian, is that the U.S. Chess Federation, they were so poor in the 1950s that, for example, we didn't send a team to the Chess Olympiad in 1954 in Amsterdam. In 1956, there was a Chess Olympiad in Moscow. We didn't send a team there either. The student teams that represented the United States in the 50s and the 60s, several of those were captained by Anthony Sadie, an international master from Los Angeles. And every year, he would have to fundraise to get money for the players for their airline tickets. And, it was just like, it was his job, as a teenager, in college to raise the money for this team. It was really a different time. And, so in some ways the players, they grew up faster, if you will, just because they became adults de facto earlier.
Next question. For listeners unfamiliar with your research, could you outline how your Fischer scholarship evolved from the unknown Bobby Fischer and the early years to later, say, full-length biography?
Well, it's sort of, taking advantage of all resources available. So, the John G. White Library in Cleveland, largest repository of chess literature in the world. This fellow John G. White, he upon his death I think it was in the late 1920s thereabouts, he bequeathed his significant library of chess literature, and he also left them with money to acquire new books. And they've been doing it ever since. So if you're a chess fan, with any interest in chess literature, Cleveland should be, on your wish list to visit. I also went to the Royal Dutch Library in The Hague. I went to to go through newspapers. I went through the Smithsonian, the National Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and that was a real great resource at the time for going through like old newspapers. Now, in the year 2025, it's possible to do so much of that sort of work that I just outlined at home. there's so many resources online, and so I've availed myself of that. But in the early days, it was very much old school. For example, I would go through newspaper columns. I would find people that Fischer played in the simul, and then I would check to see if they were still USCF members, and then if they were, I would try to find an address for them and write them a letter. And I got a lot of material that way from various chess players. I remember there was a guy by the name of Mr. Hart. He was from Kansas, and Fischer had been in Wichita in the spring of '64 and given an exhibition there, and he had preserved like a little mimeograph series of sheets that had every game from that simul that were unknown to anybody at the time. So there are always like little treasures like this here or there, but still there's still many things I don't know about his career. And I would say one of the hardest things to do is when you find old photos of Fischer, is trying to identify. You can usually make an educated guess like of what year it was or what year or two it was, especially when he's young. But from some of the photos from the 50s, like who's in the photo with him, where was it taken? I've had people like Dr. Sadie, Alan Kaufman, of a younger generation, people like Fred Wilson, the New York bookseller. I would show these photos to them, and sometimes they could identify the people. IM Salvador Salmatura, Bruce Pandolfini. I showed all these people these photos, but there's still a fair number that I don't know who the people are, where it was exactly taken, and I would like to know, more.
Yeah, that's maybe something that US Chess could help with as well if we're able to post. Definitely something that we can look into. And I did off camera, we spoke a little bit, and I was a bit surprised that Fischer was in Florida. So, and currently being in Florida, this is definitely something of interest. So, could you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. So, one of the major clubs in the United States in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, into the early 60s, was the Log Cabin Chess Club. Now, when I first heard this name, Log Cabin, I thought it was located in some rustic area of Asheville, North Carolina, for example. But nothing of the sort. It was located in West Orange, New Jersey, right across the river from New York. And the fellow that ran it was a fellow by the name of E. Forey Laux. And Mr. Laux was not a particularly strong player, but he was a tremendous chess enthusiast, and he was wealthy. It was inherited wealth from his father, and he spent a lot of his money on chess. And he opened up a club in his home in West Orange, and in the basement he had a log cabin built in, hence the name Log Cabin Chess Club. And he organized many tournaments in the 1950s and early 60s, some of which Bobby played in. But he also was famous for the Log Cabin Chess Tours. And to give one example, one of their tours took them from Long Beach, where the 1954 U.S. Open was held, to Fairbanks, Alaska. And no cruise ships were involved. They drove through British Columbia and through the Yukon and on gravel roads and whatnot. And they played they played club matches against visiting clubs along the way. And so it was that in 1956, Laux had this idea to travel from New York to Havana, and he recruited like 7 other chess players to go with him, and this included Norman Whitaker. And Norman Whitaker, who would receive the IM title emeritus in the late 1960s, was a very well-known and notorious figure in American chess circles. He was very strong player in the 1920s and 1930s, probably in the top 10 in the United States. And there's a book written on him called by John Hilbert that deals with all the facets of his life. But he's probably just as well known for his exploits off the board. And although he came from a family of money and he received an excellent education and he was a lawyer by profession, he was not a poster boy of good behavior by any stretch of the imagination, just the reverse. And he was involved in a effort to extort money from the Lindbergh family from the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And he had nothing to do with the kidnapping, but he pretended that he had information about it. And he ended up getting free room and board from the U.S. government for an extended period of time after he was prosecuted for this, really pretty evil act. But he was a fascinating figure, and as it was in the spring of 1956, he was recruited for the team. Then they got Raymond Glover, who was one of the more prominent members of the Franklin Mercantile Chess Club, one of the older clubs in the United States, from Philadelphia. And they also got one or two players from the New Jersey area. And they recruited Bobby Fischer and his mother. And at this time when this tour began, and for its duration, Fischer, he was 12 years old. And he, at that time, was probably about, he was a USCF expert, not better than 2100 though. Say somewhere like around 2050 strength. So he played board number 2 behind Whitaker. And so they drove along the eastern seaboard, and keep in mind the interstate highway system, I think it was developed around 1956. So I'm not sure what kind of driving they encountered along the way, but I suspect it was not as smooth, as it would be today. And they drove all the way from New York to Florida. And in Florida, they played club matches in Tampa, St. Petersburg, Miami, Hollywood. So some in sort of central Florida, if you will, and then some in the south. And then they went to Havana, took the boat there from Key West, and they played a match against the Capablanca Chess Club there. And Bobby gave a simul there, one of the earliest simuls that he gave, possibly the earliest. I'm not sure. There was one he gave also in Jersey City, roughly within a month or so of that one. And this tour really was something special because I think it was a real broadening for Bobby, of his life experience. Previous to that, he'd only lived, when he was very, very young, he was born in Chicago. The family lived in Arizona. They moved around a little bit. But essentially, since he was about 7 years old, they were living in New York City, and he, hadn't seen anything else. But in the South, we know from photographs, they're both in David DeLucia's books, the noted collector and Fischer, he's got a lot of Fischer gold in his collection, and from what the World Chess Hall of Fame has, that this is still at a time when there were Jim Crow laws, and so Fischer, different drinking fountains, different bathrooms, different restaurants, different hotels for people. This had to make an impact on Bobby, and so he learned a lot from that. Now, Laux, although he was wealthy, and he was generous, and he covered all the transportation costs for his team. They didn't always stay in hotels. Sometimes they camped, and they all had their sleeping bags. And there's some pictures in the collection of the World Chess Hall of Fame, because Regina was the photographer for the group there. And there's photos of the young Bobby in a sleeping bag. It's kind of funny because he was very small at the time, and you can see him. And I think it was a wild adventure for him as a little kid. But he talked a lot of chess with Whitaker, who's, as I mentioned, a very good player. And there's some correspondence in the World Chess Hall of Fame collection between Whitaker and Regina, in which Whitaker reminds her to ask Bobby about certain positions that they had analyzed, if he still remembered everything. And so it was very interesting to see that. And as far as I know, that was the only time, this would have been February of 56, for a period of about 2 weeks or so, coming and going from Havana, that Fischer was ever in Florida. I don't think he ever was. Other than that, he certainly, in the 1964, when there was a tour around the country, regrettably, I think New Orleans he was in, but not in Atlanta, not in anywhere in Florida, but one curious thing I should say about Fischer is that sometimes if you do like a Google search, you'll find Tarpon Springs, which is like near Tampa, I believe, and you'll find Fischer connected because he owned property there. And you're thinking, what the heck? What was Bobby Fischer? Well, he didn't really, it was undeveloped property. There was no house or anything on it. Then you're like, well, why did he have this? And the answer is that Fischer's grandfather, Regina's father, he moved to Florida, to the Tampa area, shortly before his death, like a year or two before. And he bought this land with the idea that he was going to do something with it. And then when he died, Regina inherited it. And then when she passed away, Fischer inherited it. And so how this ties in is that in the late 1990s, there was a famous piece of news where it came to pass that Fischer had a lot of valuables stored in a locker in I think initially it was in a Beacon storage facility, and then later that company that ran the operation there changed hands, and it was a different operation. The taxes, or not the taxes, but the yearly dues had not been paid for the fees for the storage rental hadn't been paid, and I believe also the property taxes for the Tarpon Springs property hadn't been paid for. And so, Fischer was, really, really upset because he'd given the fellow, Bob Ellsworth, money to pay for these things. And I think it wasn't really Ellsworth's fault. I mean, what had happened is that Fischer's name was on the lease, Fischer's address was on the P.O. box, was on the contact information. And so when this operation storage facility changed hands, they had no way to reach out to Ellsworth to let him know about this. So, he really wasn't to blame for this situation. Of course, Fischer had left the country in '92 to play the match with Spassky, and when he did that, he violated the Trading with Enemies Act with the U.S. government, and therefore there was a arrest warrant issued for him. And so after '92, he never came back to the United States, and so he was relying on Ellsworth to make these payments. It's interesting that he had him do so, because you would have thought that he would have sort of seen the handwriting on the wall and would have had all of his valuables brought to him in Europe. But I guess, he was still hoping maybe he would be able to come back to the United States someday.
So going backwards a bit, we've got Fischer's childhood and teenage development. And I would say the picture is very often painted that he was an inevitable genius. So what myths about his early development did you find yourself debunking in your research?
Well, the first thing is USCF ratings started in 1952, or at least in the early 1950s. And so they were published in the 1950s. They were coming out once a year. So it's good that they had a rating system, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to track Bobby's progress. But coming out always once a year meant that invariably there's going to be some sort of lag in reflecting his true playing strength. But what we do know for a fact is that in May of 1956, Fischer appeared on the USCF rating list for the first time, and he was rated around in the neighborhood of 1730. And this included tournaments he played the previous year, like he played in Lake Mohegan in the U.S. Amateur in 1955, and he played in the U.S. Junior in 1955 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Uh, as I mentioned, I would say that he was probably about expert strength by early 1956. So that he was born in 1943, so he was like an expert when he was 13. So being rated 1730 at the age of 12, well, that's not bad. But today it's like nothing. I mean, it's something, but it's not much. Okay, just there's so many stronger young players, and being rated an expert at 13, well, that's better yet. But there's so many players that are like masters when they're 13. So how did a player that was rated 1730 when they were 12 become U.S. champion when they were 14 and a candidate for the World Championship when they were 15? So I think in Fischer's case, he was a prodigy, but not by the way we normally define one, in the sense that, you know, at the age of 12, you could find thousands of kids in the United States that would be stronger than him today. But by the age of 15, no, you wouldn't, okay? You wouldn't find anybody as strong as he was, pretty much. Although, you know, Andy Woodward's awful good, you know, and Mishra is also very good. He's 16, so, but they wouldn't be quite rated in the top 10 in the world. You know, when they're not qualifying from an interzonal to play, you know, in the candidates. So how did Fischer do it? Well, there's a very interesting book by William Lombardi that appeared in the 2010s, and Lombardi, it's part game collection, part biographical, and in the biographical section, Lombardi refers to himself as Fischer's teacher, and he says he was Fischer's teacher at the beginning, and he was all the way up to the match in Reykjavik. And that anybody else that claims to be Fischer's teacher, particularly Jack Collins, is just full of it. That he was the one and only teacher. Okay, so certainly what we know about Lombardi is that he was a terrific talent. I mean, he is best known probably for winning the World Junior with a perfect score in 1957. At the same time, mind you, that tournament was held when Bobby was winning the U.S. Open that year. He also is known for captaining the U.S. student team in Leningrad in 1960 to gold medal, beating Boris Spassky with the Black Pieces. So Lombardi has some real credentials. Although I would say, rather than those two events, I would point to a match he drew with he lost to Reshevsky 3.5, 2.5, around 1956 or so. And also playing in the 1958 Olympiad on board 2 and playing remarkably well, and taking into account that because a lot of the Jewish high holidays occurred during that Olympiad, and Reshevsky, being an observant Jew, could not play in those days, Lombardi ended up playing like half the event on board 1 and more than held his own. Like he drew with Botvinnik with black. But Lombardi never really fully realized his true potential as a player. Now, one explanation of that could be just the fact that he, became a priest, and so from the early 1960s onwards, his playing opportunities were more limited for much of his career. But I would still say that the Lombardi of 56 or 57 that potentially showed, even before Lombardi entered the priesthood, he maybe wasn't on the same trajectory, not like a Fischer trajectory where he's improving tremendously along the way. I mention that because, for example, he played a match with Larry Evans around in the early 60s, and he lost that match. Very closely contested. Maybe it was like 5.5, 4.5. But it sort of is evidence that he was not like the best player in the United States after Bobby. I mean, he was one of the best. And you could throw Evans and Reshevsky and Robert Byrne in that equation, but he he wasn't unequivocally like, this player that would have become world champion if he had just totally dedicated himself to chess. I don't think that there's enough evidence to point to that. So, what was his role in the development of Bobby Fischer? Well, it's a bit tricky because both those players are written about extensively in My Seven Chess Prodigy, as are the Byrne brothers. This is a book by Jack Collins. It's a great read. I can definitely warmly recommend it to anybody that has an interest in chess, and particularly chess history in the 50s and 60s. Well, Lombardi doesn't say not only did Collins not help Fischer, but he said that essentially he didn't help the Byrne brothers, he didn't help Lombardi, he didn't help Raymond Weinstein. And all those are people that are featured in My Seven Chess Prodigies. And what I would say to that is that, to be fair to Lombardi, that he was a better player than all those other players I've mentioned when he first met Collins. Fischer first started working with Collins in the summer of 1956, at which point he was probably about 2100 strength. He was soon to win the U.S. Junior for the first time and to make this quantum leap. But in the case of Lombardi, he was already a strong master when he started working with Collins. Now, Collins was a strong player in his own right. He was probably, like senior master equivalent. He was one of the top 15 players in the United States. I would say his understanding of the game might have even been stronger than that if you take into account that he suffered for some serious physical challenges, that he had to use a wheelchair. He likely, in long games, endurance was probably not his strong suit. So he had an excellent understanding of the game. He was a very good correspondence player. But Lombardi, when they first met, was probably the better player. But in all the other cases, the Byrne brothers, Weinstein, Fischer, that was demonstrably not the case. Collins was clearly the better player when they first met. And so if you look at Fischer from the summer of 56 to the summer of 58, that is from about a 2100 player to qualifying for the interzonal, let's call him 2600, okay? That's a 500-point leap. And as you know, Brian, I mean, it's one thing to go from like 1,000 to 1,500 or 1,500 to 2,000, but the air gets thinner somehow, and you get your rating goes up. The level of progression becomes that much more difficult, and so this leap was, for those of your listeners that are track and field fans, I would call it Beeman-esque, after Bob Beeman, the great long jump record holder, from Mexico City, 68, where he jumped over 29 feet, and just shocked people. Well, Fischer made a similar leap, and I say Collins gets a fair degree of credit. Not as a teacher in the sense that he had a formalized series of lessons that he gave, where every day they said, we're going to work on this and this and this. It was much less structured, but what he did is he provided an environment that allowed Bobby to immerse himself in chess. And Collins lived at that time with his sister in an apartment on Lenox Road. And their home doubled as what was called the Hawthorne Chess Club, a name that had been given to the club when Collins lived on Hawthorne Street in a prior residence of his. So this residence of Collins was within short distance of Erasmus High School, where Bobby Fischer went, as did Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand and all these famous people. Well, Fischer, a typical day for Fischer between 1956 and 58 during the school year was he would get up in the morning, he would go to school. At noon, he would leave the school campus and go over to Collins' home. They would have lunch together, and they would look and study and play chess for an hour. At 1 o'clock, the bell would ring, and Fischer would sprint back to Erasmus High School. He'd be there for another 2 hours of class, and then 3 o'clock he'd run back over to Collins' home. From 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 9 o'clock in the evening, he would be at the Collins home. He would have dinner with uh, uh, Jack and his sister Edith, and they would treat him as if he was one of their family. And during that time, Fischer just lived and breathed chess. And so he would play Collins' training games. He would play Collins' endless 10 seconds a move games. That is where there would be a special clock with a bell on it, and every 10 seconds you had to make a move. In some ways, a precursor to today's increment time controls, in that you always had time on your clock. It wasn't like 5 minute chesses, which is what I grew up on, where flagging your opponent was, part and parcel of the game. Here, with the 10 seconds of move, you could still play decent end games, within reason. Well, there was a third member of this group, and that was Raymond Weinstein, who also played with Bobby and with Collins, and they would play something called risers, where two people would play, and one guy would kibitz and watch, and then when whoever lost had to rise up and get up, and the other guy would take a seat. And that must have been a ferocious competition between the three of them, because if you look at Fischer's development, I said it was already off the charts, but you look at Weinstein's development, he had started working with Collins about a year and a half earlier than Fischer, and he was maybe like a class A player at the time. But by 1960, say he started working like in middle of 54 or so. In the space of like a little over 5 years, Weinstein had made huge progress. So in 1960, he finished third in the U.S. Championship behind Fischer and Rushevsky, qualifying to play in the interzonal. He played on the U.S. Olympic team with Lombardi and Fischer, and team won the silver medal. This is also in 1960. He played on that gold medal winning student team along with with Lombardi and Sadie and Charles Colmy and others. And Edmar Mendes was also on that team. And he'd won the first of three consecutive Marshall Chess Club championships he would win. So what a great year for Weinstein. Now, sadly, Weinstein would suffer serious mental illness. He developed schizophrenia, and he was never the same. And he although he still kept playing chess up until like the mid 60s, he hasn't played a tournament game in 60 years, and he ended up killing somebody, and ended up at the Kirby Institute for the Criminally Insane on Randall Island, New York City, where he spent over half a century. And just a very tragic, very sad story, because one of the things that I learned from the archives that they have now at the World Chess Hall of Fame is that Regina was always concerned about Bobby, that he wouldn't develop, he would become a great player, but he wouldn't develop socially, he wouldn't develop academically. She wanted him to be well grounded in all areas of life. And who did she look to as one of her examples for Bobby? Raymond Weinstein. He was a student at Erasmus High School. He would later graduate from college and go to graduate school. And he, in one letter, she writes to him and asks him to keep her apprised when Bobby went to the Leipzig Olympiad. Look after Bobby, make sure he's okay. And so there's this postcard from Weinstein in which he describes everything, and you see that in many ways Weinstein was like the son that Regina hoped for. He was this guy who was very kind and excelled academically and was this great player. But it shows you that how sometimes you don't life can be strange, and this guy who had all these things going for him, because schizophrenic, and there was probably no treatment plans available for him, and he just went off the deep end. So, in summary, I say that Collins played a major role in Fischer's development, not necessarily like as a pure chess teacher, but as like a mentor and as a guy who just provided an environment where Fischer could just like, at that Hawthorne Chess Club on the weekends, strong players from all over New York City would come in. They'd be looking at chess. Uh, they'd be playing chess. They'd be looking, analyzing games. Uh, Collins had a huge library. At the time, as I mentioned, the amount of chess literature in English was very limited. But in Collins' case, he addressed that issue by having books in various European languages and in Russian. And one of the books that made or a series of books, I should say, that made a real impression on Fischer was the four-volume series on Steinitz by Bachmann. And Fischer just went through that. And then you see Fischer's games from the early 1960s, like particularly like around 63, his adoption of knight h3 and the two knights defense, his advocacy for 5d3 in the Roy Lopez, which is so popular today. Lots of different Steinitz ideas percolated in his head at the time. And he, in his column, Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, which is actually, it's not Bobby Fischer. It was called Bobby Fischer Talks Chess. And this column ran around 60, I want to say around 63, maybe it carried over into 64. Fischer analyzed all the games that Steinitz played in a match against an Italian player, Dubois, in 1862. This is like obscure. I mean, who would know about this match? I'm sure that, maybe Lasker did, but like probably no other world champion knew about this match. And yet there was Fischer, and he analyzed 8 of these games for the readers of Chess Life. So I think that if you look at the development of Weinstein also, how did he get to be so good? Well, he also hung out at the Hawthorne Chess Club all the time. So these two young players, and I think the two of them butting heads a lot like that, competition like that when you're young, as long as it's in a constructive fashion, really, can pay dividends. And I think Weinstein probably lost a lot more games than he won against Fischer, especially later on, but it made him that much a better player. Just like losing all these games to Yasser Seirawan when I was young, it definitely, I learned a tremendous amount from it and toughened me up.
It's an amazing thing because I personally always had that perspective that Fischer was isolating to a great degree. You get taught himself to read multiple languages in order to stay up on chess text and articles around the world. That I don't know. I felt that it was mostly self-driven, but this interview in particular is giving a different perspective of community in chess and that benefit of working with a group of strong players, and coming back to our first interview, taking those opportunities to play against better players when you can in order to get better. You got to stomach the loss, but it's a huge part of improvement.
Yes. Well, one thing I should also mention about Fischer is that, if you look at his career, in some ways it could be read as like, this march to the world championship. But there were a lot of steps backward, and there were a lot of fortuitous circumstances. And one of them was the Fischer family settling in New York in 1950, or late 1949, I think it was. And if they had not, Fischer would never have developed to the extent that he did. Unlike today, when it's possible for a player from a relatively less developed chess region to become a strong player because of the internet, because of all the electronic resources. In those days, it was like you lived in New York City or you didn't, because that's where all the good players lived. There was the Rapids at the Marshall on Tuesday. There were the Rapids at the Manhattan on Friday. These are like 10 seconds a move, where all the best players played. Were very, very good training ground for Fischer. I would say that Fischer did develop on his own after he got to, once he won the U.S. championship, and he, I would say by the summer of 1958, Fischer, you know, he was his own man by that point as far as chess improvement. There's nothing that he could really gain more from. He still went to the Hawthorne Club sometimes, although not long after that, summer of 58, I think in 59, Collins moved to Bedford Stuyvesant, no, to Stuyvesant Township in Manhattan, Stuyvesant Township. So, if Collins had lived in Manhattan when Fischer was growing up, instead of living in Brooklyn, that could have changed things right there. If not slowed Fischer from, maybe it would at least have delayed his development. Uh, the other thing I would say is that if you look at Fischer's development after, in the 60s, the person that definitely played the most important role in Fischer's development then, because remember Lombardi said he was Fischer's teacher all the way up until 1972. Uh, I would argue that really the individual that had the most contact with Fischer, that analyzed the most with him, was Bernard Zuckerman, who's an international master. FIDE rating at, I think the peak was 2490 at a time when it put him in the top 100 players in the world, roughly, maybe the top 120, who got off to a very late start, didn't start playing until he was 14. He started playing after Fischer became world champion, or U.S. champion in 58. It was maybe like March. Both Fischer and Zuckerman were born in March of 43, but Zuckerman came to the game much later. But Zuckerman was a tremendous opening theoretician, extremely knowledgeable about the end game, and he was somebody that Bobby could talk openings to, that was at his level. And some of the opening lines, like I mentioned that 9 knight h3 in the two knights, Zuckerman actually played in a tournament game before Fischer did. And that knight h3 of Chigorin's had not been played for, over half a century, when those guys essayed it. So, in serious competition. So Zuckerman is the guy I would point to. Now, to go back to Lombardi, I would say, did he play a role in Fischer's development? I would say yes, he did. Keep in mind, he grew up in the Bronx, not in Brooklyn, so Fischer would have only seen him probably like at the Marshall or the Manhattan, or on the weekends at the Hawthorne. But if you look at Fischer's openings, that's where it might have played a major role, because Fischer, in that beginning of 1956, when he was on that log cabin tour, he answered e4 with e5, and he was kind of playing like Giotto piano setups. There was no knight or Sicilian. There was no King's Indian defense, or if there was, not consistently. But somewhere in 56, he made that shift over. And that could very well have been him emulating Lombardi. And both those openings in the 50s were sort of in their developmental phase. And so there's a lot of room for individual work. And Fischer definitely in the 50s and 60s benefited from the work that he did on both those openings for sure.
And speaking with analysis and openings, as your most recent text, Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer, it does explore his own annotations and writings. What reoccurring strategic or psychological pattern do you find across his best games?
Well, one thing about Fischer was he doesn't talk about it too much. Maybe he touched upon it in his Boy's Life column, but it was kind of a standard practice in the 50s and 60s for the elite players, when facing their peers, to they would try to block with black and win with white, and they would play a lot of very classical systems with black. Queen's Gambit declined, the black side of the Roy Lopez. And Fischer did play both those in the early 1960s, but he found that his experiences playing 3 bishop c5 against the Rui, His experience playing the Tardik over Makaganov, Queen's Gambit decline, they they didn't give him the dynamic positions that he wanted because he wanted to try to win with the black pieces. When he sat down, he was trying to win every single game. And so I think that one of Fischer's lasting testimonies to chess was his color blindness. Nowadays it's really hard to win with the black pieces at the elite level if your opponent isn't willing to mix it up. It's pretty close to impossible. Uh, you know, the problem is you can play like substandard openings as black to try to avoid simplification, uh, but you take huge risk, and so at the very elite level you can it's one thing if you're playing in like these FIDE knockouts and you get to the faster time controls. There the equation changes, but in classical games between two 2700 players, if the player is white is uh, not willing to take any risk, it's really challenging for black. I mean, you're going to have to play something very solid that's maybe slightly, but that prevents massive simplification, that allows for you to have a game and then just try to gradually outplay your opponent. I mean, you can look at Magnus Carlsen for the examples of how to do that best, probably. But in Bobby's time, the top players, guys like Rushevsky, usually with black, they, against their peers, draws were quite acceptable. And, and even like Karpov would be, jumping ahead of Fischer, would return to that formula, if you will. But in the case of Fischer, it was like try to win with both colors. So I think that's one of his lasting legacies. And you see that, in his games collections, there's a lot of his games with the black pieces. It's not just a collection of, his best white victories. So there's definitely that. I would say other things that stand out in his writings. One thing, he was always really meticulous about trying to be as accurate as possible. And Helge Olafsson, in his recent book, like in the century, about Fischer's last years in Iceland, mentions how Fischer caught a mistake in in a televised analysis of some game that he saw from the Icelandic, I think it was Rapid Championship or something, and then he shared it with Helgi, and then Helgi said, "Could I put this in my newspaper column?" And Fischer said, "Let's look it over first, more carefully," because he tried to make his work to be of the highest quality as possible. So I think that that was another thing. Also, Fischer was always very good about giving credit. Sometimes you would see players take credit for something that somebody else had discovered. But Fischer was usually very meticulous about, acknowledging where he got some idea from. I do mention a few examples in the book where there were Bernard Zuckerman, in his critique of 60 Memorable Games, he points out a few divergences that, but generally speaking, Fischer, when it concerned chess matters, not things to do outside of chess, but in the game of chess, his standards were high. I mean, his behavior at the board was always very correct. He never tried to distract his opponent. He even went so far that when he played in the candidates matches, when he fell ill against Petrosian in their candidates final match in Buenos Aires in 1970, he had a serious cold in the first half of the match. He could easily have asked to have some of those games postponed, but he sort of felt like that chess players are like sportsmen. Somebody shows up for an NBA game, if they're sick, a little bit, as long as they, or football, as long as they can still play, they play. And he felt like he wasn't that sick, he could still play, so he did. And also, I think that he raised the standards for professional chess Uh, today the prizes that he competed for might seem relatively modest, but for example, in Reykjavik, I think the first prize was like for the winner was like maybe 125,000. But keep in mind that previous to that, the previous championship, the first prize was under $5,000. Now it's a little tricky because it was a match between two Soviets, and becoming world champion gave you a lot of perks that could quantify in dollar terms. But still, the fact is that Fischer did a lot to raise the level of professional standards for elite chess.
Would you say that that's the greatest outcome coming out of the Fischer Spassky match? That, say, culturally and commercially, that was the biggest impact.
Well, certainly, I mean, that match in '72, uh, chess will never attract worldwide attention the way it did then. I mean, it's impossible. I mean, because it was that there were all the pieces were in the right places. For example, it was a match between a Soviet player and an American player, so you had this Cold War element to it. Which the individual versus the group, uh, the state, if you will. You also had the fact that there was no internet. There was like three major stations, and there were newspapers and magazines, and they all covered this match extensively. And today the world's attention span is much more diffuse. So I think it would be very difficult to ever get to that level. But obviously, if you look at it, we're living through a golden age of chess now. I mean, with the record participation of individuals. When it shows up, in a series like the Queen's Gambit, uh, uh, you know, the chess world is a much it's not only a bigger place, but it's a much broader place. I mean, I remember when players like Anand from India and Granda Zuniga from Peru, when they first came in, it was like, like there's not supposed to be chess players from places like that, not players of that level. But nowadays, you look at like Uzbekistan got two of the four players that were playing in the World Cup made it to the final four. India won the last chess Olympiad for both men and the open competition and the women's competition. The chess world is much more universal now, and that's really a positive thing. That we can be grateful for.
So with Fischer's writings and his voice, you talked about his passion for accuracy. How would you say that his openings hold up from back then with his research to today with modern engines?
Well, see, that's the thing. For example, one of Fischer's favorite books growing up was uh, chess. It was a book by a Russian author, and it was the name's escaping me for the second for the moment. It was questions of opening theory, and oh god, I don't know why I'm having a senior moment here. So this individual wrote a really really fine book, and half of it was devoted to the Rogozin defense of the Queen's Gambit. This book was republished maybe in the last 10 years by Quality Chess, but they had to take out all the section on the Rogozin pretty much because the theories of opening changed. So Fischer, a lot of his work that he did in the Najdorf has been superseded. A lot of his opening stuff is changed, but that's sort of typical. I mean, things change, but if he had come back, if he came back in time, obviously he'd have access to modern opening theory. He would be able to catch up very quickly. But I don't know that he would enjoy the process, because one of the things for Fischer that made it so interesting and fun was that he was able to discover all this stuff. Granted, today you know, there's still, people still find things of value. I mean, you'll have a situation where the computer might give five moves of equal value, but in fact, one of those five requires the player of black to play perfect for like 10 moves in a row, so not a very practical choice. Another couple lead to positions where you have to find like some really hard moves, so again, not the best practical choice. So, you know, the grandmasters of today are looking at positions that they like to play, that will be difficult for their opponent to play, that objectively by computer standards are nothing special, but but in a human environment could prove to be quite successful. So in the case of Fischer, it was a much different situation. He would actually be able to, you know, not only find like novelties, but find whole new strategic conceptions, like this idea I mentioned in the King's Indian attack, where he would advance a queenside, his rook pawn one square, and you know, break a classical maxim of chess. Don't play on the wing side where you're weaker. But he figured out that you got more from that exchange than you gave, and so I would say that. Yeah, I don't know how Fischer, he was already in the 1990s bemoaning the fact that opening analysis was getting to be overwhelming. And his solution, of course, was, Fischer random, or 960 as they call it now. He wasn't the first person to devise this, have thinking along these lines. David Bronstein had anticipated some of his thoughts. But and certainly there are some players that really like this 960 chess right now. But I think to myself personally, I mean, just as an aside, I sort of like the idea that Ken Rogoff mentioned of where, you might have like a 50 or 100 opening positions that are like standard positions to play, and maybe like in 10 or 15 years when openings are, so it's gotten so out of control that all the games would be drawn if they just played set positions. If they just played certain main opening variations, that what you could do is you could have you could draw for lots and just have to play a certain standard opening position that's judged to be equal going into it. So yeah, I think with Fischer, I don't know that his opening analysis, for the most part, that's asking a lot for it to survive, a half a century. But a lot of his analysis and a lot of his conclusions in his game annotations are still very, very on solid ground. Occasionally, maybe he makes some analytical error here or there, but for the most part, with but a few exceptions, you don't see a situation where he's like totally wrong. I mean, one of the most humbling things is you probably know, I mean, I certainly do, is that, when I put my old games in chess engines, that warm glow I used to get from some games, it's been kind of hollowed out by the thought that, like, what was I thinking? My opponent and I, we were like, seeing eye dogs for the blind, we needed them because we missed all this stuff left and right, and, that's just the way it is, I mean.
So in 2025, with Fischer decades past and engines dominating chess, what do you think his lasting legacy for how we teach and study chess is?
Well, he certainly always loved chess. There's no question about that. He might not have loved some of the personalities involved with it, but he always loved the game itself. And even after he stopped playing, whether you want to say that he stopped playing in 72 or 92, he still loved chess literature. He still loved going over games. It was always a part of him. And I think that one thing that is clear about chess is that it makes a great lifelong hobby. I mean, I have non-chess playing friends who are retired, and they're kind of envious. Like, you have this built-in hobby, you have built-in friends, you have a built-in community. It is definitely something you can do all your life. it's definitely something you can always learn new things about. I think those are things that were attractive for Bobby as well. Uh, I think that going back to that issue with his openings, he had an issue with that. I would have loved to know also, nobody ever asked him this, but there's another way of looking at it, and that's like table base, where, you know, all the positions, with, first it was like, 4 or 5, 6, 7 pieces. Uh, they're known. The result is known. There's no guessing. Two bishops and king versus knight and king. It's winning. Uh, you know, that sort of thing wasn't. There was a thought that back in the day that if you put the black king on the like on h8 and a knight on g7, you put that in any of the four corners, you could hold those positions. But if you look at table base, usually the superior side's always winning those. So I would, if I had a list of questions I could ask Bobby, one of them would be like, he was upset by the way opening theory was overwhelming the game he loved. But I'm also curious what he thought on the reverse end, with table base, did he like that you could now know the absolute truth about those positions, or did he not like the fact that you know you know the secrets have been revealed by machines and not by humans?
That's a fascinating point. Is that I'm often working with my students that are 1800 plus, and this generation is so attached to computer evaluation, and I very often have to describe opening selection a lot like bluffing in poker at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what keeps it interesting to me, is how much risk are you willing to take in order to play for a win. And I like the contribution Fischer had as constantly playing for a win. The colorless approach of I'm trying to win with black every time I sit down. Where that risk threshold is, it really has to be taught to this generation, because they do not want to take risks. They're extremely risk averse, from what I've found.
Well, in Fischer's case, it wasn't just the openings. It was like his whole approach to the entire game. And there's some games of Fischer's that are analyzed by Ivan Sokolov, the Yugoslav Dutch grandmaster, who shows how Fischer would, oftentimes in positions he would take risk, but it would be in such a situation that he would be suitably rewarded for it. That he still felt, even though he was taking this risk, that he could still defend the position, even though it would be a little bit more of it would require more skill to do so than the position he had prior to taking on this obligation. But there were other cases, though, where Fischer overstretched, and the most famous, of course, is where he took on h2 against Spassky in game one of the match. And people have often wondered, how could Fischer make this elementary blunder, that everybody knows you don't capture such a pawn because your piece gets trapped like that. But the explanation that I've heard that gives the both this question was raised to William Lombardi when he was at the Mechanics Club, and he explained it the best I've ever had it explained. He basically said that Fischer, when he took on h2, he saw the game was still a draw, which indeed with perfect play it was. But what Sokolov points out is that this was the rare instance of Fischer taking on risk without receiving appropriate potential reward as a result of that, in that all it went from being a draw to a difficult, you had to work like a dog to draw the position, whereas in other games where Fischer took on risk, it was with the chance of getting realistic winning chances. So, Fischer, it wasn't just about playing dynamic openings with black. It was just his mindset.
That's very fascinating. So we've talked a lot about the positive aspects of Fisher's approach and what should be emulated. Say, with his development in mind, what are aspects that we should avoid?
Well, I think as far as all the chess aspects of it, uh, Fisher, uh, as I said, his behavior at the board, his approach to studying, all those things were on exemplary. Uh, I think that Fisher's the demons that he had, you know, those you know Fisher, he had a. I mentioned that moving to New York City. I mentioned that being in the Collins environment. All those were really good things for him, but there were also dark things in his youth. One of the things is his mother, Regina, was on the FBI watch list, and she was on that list because, all right, this was the 1950s during the McCarthy era. Uh, there were fears about communist infiltration of the United States. Well, she had lived in the Soviet Union from roughly 1933 to 1938, and in fact, her daughter Joan was born in Moscow, but she was not a communist. I think anybody that survived the purges of Stalin in the 1930s uh, would not be a communist. Okay, she was a socialist, and in much the way that the current mayor-elect of New York City is, and she strongly believed in nuclear disarmament, and she believed in world peace, and one could agree with her views or disagree with her views, but she was sincere in them, and she was not violent. And she lives in the United States. She has a right to express herself. But in the 1950s, she was on this watch list, and so Bobby, he had to open the door a couple times, and there would be agents there asking, him questions, and he had to be, if his mother wasn't at home, he was told, my mother's not at home, I'm not supposed to speak to you, all this sort of thing. Not a good environment to grow up as a kid. So I think that, it was not a traditional childhood in that sense, and I think that that definitely colored some of Fisher's later life. Fisher also, he came from a family that had mental health challenges. His grandmother died in a mental, asylum in New York City. Uh, the Fisher family, they always say that, genius and insanity are like, right tipping at the edges. And I think that there's a lot to be said for the Fisher family. Regina was a brilliant woman who spoke multiple languages, but she had a couple times in her life where she was, also just the strain of raising two young children by herself was also very difficult. If you look at the case of Fisher, his father, as we know now, was Paul Nemenyi, famous physicist. So Fisher had two brilliant parents, very high IQ individuals, but Regina and Nemenyi, they didn't, they were not able to live as man and wife, and so Fisher didn't have the benefit of sort of like a two-family household. Not only that, but Regina usually would have to work, multiple jobs to keep her little family together. So Bobby, especially when he was, young, like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, he had to spend a lot of time, alone at home after school. So again, not an ideal, you know, environment to raise a child. Uh, you know, it's kind of sad looking back, but untreated mental illness doesn't magically get better usually. And I think in the case of Bobby, of course, a lot of his views, uh, there's questions like, his anti-Semitism, his interest in the Third Reich. Uh, Unfortunately, uh, some of those things are coming back now. I shudder to think that, Fischer today, the Fischer of the 1990s and the early 2000s, he would have champions today for some of those views. I mean, this is a chess discussion, so I'll sort of leave it there. But it's kind of a question. When you when it came to chess, Fischer was 100% objective. You know, but when it came to things outside of chess, he didn't apply the same rigor or standards. And a concrete example I can offer of that is that a good friend of mine, Steve Brandwine, who's a USCF master who worked with me at the mechanics, when Fischer stayed in San Francisco around 1980-81, he made two different visits, and one of them he stayed with Peter Biasis and his wife Ruth, and the other time he stayed with his good friend Jim Buff. And when he stayed with Jim Buff, he Brandwine was living with Buff at the time, so he saw Fischer quite a bit. And one day, Fischer and uh, Brandwine, they went to a bookstore called Znania, which in Russian means knowledge. It was located on Geary Avenue in San Francisco. San Francisco had a lot of white Russians that came to the city after the Russian Revolution. It's always had a large Russian community, and hence it had this bookstore. There was also one in New York City that Fischer was familiar with called the Four Continents bookstore, and these would sell chess literature. And Brandwine Fischer first went to the Znania, they got their chess literature, and then they went to another Russian language bookshop, an English bookshop that sold other books, not just on chess itself. And so Fischer, he picked up a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and Brandwine said, like, he and Fischer were both Jewish. He's like, "What are you reading this crazy, crappy book for?" And Fischer said, "No, this book has a lot of wisdom to it." And Fischer and Brandwine just said, "This book has been shown to be a hoax. This is what's wrong with it." And he goes point by point by point. And Fischer didn't acknowledge it. He just changed the subject. So I think that I don't know, nobody's perfect, and different people have different ways of thinking things, but it always struck me that you have this guy who, when it comes to chess, is so objective and so professional and so rigorous, but outside of it, he doesn't apply the same standards.
So, when focusing on Fischer's best games, if I had to force you to pick top six, which games would you choose and why?
Well, I would pick probably some of the games that come to mind. I mean, the game of the century, just because, it's such a special game and he was so young. I definitely picked that game. I might pick his game with Jimmy Sherwin from the U.S. his first U.S. championship victory, which was a game that he thought that he was winning near the end, and it's a very famous combination. But it turns out that Sherwin, who's a terrific player in U.S. championships in the 50s and 60s, if he had more time on the clock, the final result could have been different. I would say that his famous game with Petrosian, where he exchanges his good knight on c5 for the bad bishop on d7. There's a game of Rubinstein's where he does something similar to that. I don't know if Fischer was aware of it or not, but it shows how concrete Fischer's chess was. It was intuition and calculation. I'd say some of the games from the match in Reykjavik, the Queen's Gambit Decline game, just a model game. I'd say maybe one of those King's Indian attacks that he played. Maybe the game with Pano, for example. Just not easy to make a choice. One of the things I will say that I really regretted was I regretted the fact that Fischer never annotated any of his games. From his most successful period of his life. Namely the end of his career. The last game I think in 60 Memorable was from 67 against Stein from Seuss. He did analyze a few more games in his Boys Life column, but for the most, and of course, Chess Meets of the Century, he analyzes some of his games with Petrosian, but they're not like 60 Memorable Games type of annotations, and that's one regret that later in his life that he never analyzed those games for publication.
For fans who want to know more about Fischer, which of your books would be the best entry point?
I would say it would be Bobby Fischer and His World. But I would really say that you will also get a tremendous benefit. You'll get even more benefit from it if you've read like Endgame, for example, from Frank Brady or Profile of Prodigy, but probably just reading Endgame and then segue over to that, and the books complemented each other quite well.
Are there any unfinished projects, undiscovered archives, or future volumes on Fischer you'd like to pursue?
I might do something on Fischer's, all of his exhibition tours. This kind of like a little bit esoteric. Maybe it'll be just something like an ebook form or just a chess-based file or something. But Fischer, I've collected a lot of material that relates to his tour of Argentina in 1970 after his match, 71, after his match with Petrosian. He was in Argentina for a month. He gave roughly 20 exhibitions. They were always 20 boards. Some of them featured masters up to like 2400 strength. Fischer was quoted as saying that he played many instructive games during the Simul tour because the Argentinian players, he had to play very sharply in the opening to finish them off. Play like get a good opening, sharp position, and then play very sharply in the middle game. Because if you let the games drag on, they were good practical players, and there were a lot of them. In the exhibitions, it could make for a very difficult exhibition if you didn't knock them out quickly. And I found a lot of material on the cities he visited, the results he had, and some of his games as well. And where he mentioned that he valued these games highly is that he said that all the score sheets from all of his opponents from all these simuls in Argentina, they had to give him the original, and they got to keep the carbon copy. And he kept all those, and he kept them in that storage locker. And when the storage locker was auctioned off, the contents, the score sheets seemed to have disappeared. And he said these games were priceless. He called them worth millions of dollars. Well, I would just say politely, I don't think they were worth millions of dollars, but I think that they would have been a great find for the chess world. Who knows what we could have found in those game scores. Probably many of them were not the greatest quality of play, but maybe there'd be some interesting openings, things that you didn't see him play otherwise. You never know.
Well, that's going to close out our series, and I sincerely appreciate you coming on to be a guest on One Move at a Time.